Cat, and I'm back because what once was will be again, or at least it can be if you're jonesing for a fix of the Game of Thrones. I suggest that you go and watch the series from BBC called The Hollow Crown. And I got a link down in the bottom where you could go see all the different um, sections, videos on YouTube. There's 3 of them. And it's about 7.5 hours. So you can break it up however you'd like, or maybe you could want to binge watch it. And essentially what this is BBC producing 3 of Shakespeare's plays. And it's Henry VI, Part 1, Henry VI, Part 2, and Richard III. It's Shakespeare's version of the Game of Thrones. It's the history of a War of Roses. It has Benedict Cumberbatch in it as Richard III, and let me tell you, he's really good. I love his Richard III. And of course, I've seen him as Hamlet as well on another occasion. And Benedict Cumberbatch, if you're not 100% familiar, he's the main actor out of the Sherlock Holmes series that was most recently put out. So he makes an excellent Richard III in this series. I know, you're like, Shakespeare? No! Oh my gosh, I don't like Shakespeare. Well, some of you might not. But really, having watched the Game of Thrones, it really made me appreciate these Shakespeare plays even more. I read these plays a long time ago, and I actually saw Richard III performed once. And I have to say that, yeah, I really never cared for Henry VI, Part 1 or 2 or 3. I think Shakespeare actually puts it in 3 parts, but I always found those hard going. I appreciated Richard III because the villainy, the Richard III's hand-wringing villainy, and the cynical dramatization of that, it was just good in its own right. But you really have to watch all 3 plays together to actually get the whole idea. And you know what? Shakespeare is actually all over the Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. For instance, in this series of plays by Shakespeare, these 3 plays, there's a lot of prophecy and foreshadowing, which is exactly what happens in the Game of Thrones. In this series of plays by Shakespeare, you have, for instance, Margaret of Anjou. After Henry VI is finally deposed and her son is murdered and they are putting her into prison, she curses all the actors, all the players. She curses even those who just have a peripheral act, that maybe they weren't directly responsible for what happened to her, but she prophesizes what is going to happen to them. Like, you remember Tyrion telling Cersei a long time ago that someday he hopes he's around to see her joy turn to ashes in her mouth. And or Melisandre, when she is talking to Arya and she's looking at her, I see death on you, girl. I smell it on you. I thought it was the Lord, but it's you, right? So lots of prophecy and foreshadowing. And then in Shakespeare, there's this idea that your sins come back to haunt you, just like in the Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire. And it's really presented to you not only in Margaret Anjou's, curses and prophecies to the main characters, but towards the last of Richard III, when Richard, right before the battle, he's sleeping and he has this nightmare where all the people that he's murdered comes back to literally haunt him and prophesy his death. Or when his mother, a little prior to that, is talking about when he was born, bloody he was when he was born, and bloody will be his end. And that's exactly what happens to him. More so, you get this idea that this is one of those reasons. It's like a psychological thing that's playing on him, and it's one of the reasons why he's going to lose the Battle of Bosworth, because his conscience is in the back of his mind, just makes him derelict and unable to be the one that defeats him, Henry Tudor, or his moral deficiencies are the cause, amongst his many other rationales. And actually, there are a couple other Shakespeare plays, by the way, that show up in the Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire. And one of those scenes that really hits you, if you know what you're looking at, is when Jon Snow gets stabbed at the Black Fortress. He is called to a meeting. He goes out there, and at first nobody's there, and he sees the sign tacked up that says traitor, and then these men surround him, and then they stab him, and they're like, for the watch, for the watch. And then finally, at the last, when he's almost dead, Ollie, this young boy that he's taken under his wing and he's always treated kindly and tried to show him how to be the best way that he could be, he walks up and he's getting ready to stab Jon Snow, and Jon Snow is sad and is like, Ollie, you don't want to do this. And Ollie just looks at him and he stabs him anyway for the watch. This is very much Julius Caesar in the Senate, where Julius Caesar goes to this meeting and all of these senators stab him for the Republic, because they blame him for betraying this idea of the Republic, which is actually already dead, kind of like the watch. The Black Watch, you know that the Black Watch is already dying. And so these guys blame Jon Snow for this last little act where he brings the wildlings across the wall, like Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. So these men stab Julius Caesar, and then the last to come up to him as he lay dying is his friend Brutus. And Julius Caesar says those most famous lines, "Et tu, Brutus?" And Brutus stabs him for the Republic. So there you go. There's some more Shakespeare, and there's some more. We'll talk about it because Macbeth is in here and a couple other ones. But back to this series, The Hollow Crown, which is these 3 Shakespeare plays put together. And let me tell you, these are good. This isn't just like some stage acting and some painted scenes. This is very much a movie. It's the Shakespeare plays presented as a movie, but as the Shakespeare play. And it's excellent, I guarantee you. But you think about it, how did people get their history back then? So you imagine that 80% of the population doesn't read, doesn't have the resources or the leisure time to really do it because they're too busy trying to live. And maybe they scrabble up a penny and they go set it down in the bottom part of the theater in the cheap seats, and they go and see Shakespeare. And this is how they get their history of the War of the Roses, as they see these 3 plays. Very much like modern people get their history. I mean, how many people actually just get their history from dramatized TV series or movies like Braveheart or The Patriot? Or say, what do people only know about World War II is because they saw Pearl Harbor with Ben Affleck and or Saving Private Ryan, right? So how did people back then know what happened during the War of the Roses? Well, because Shakespeare told them. The other way that these Shakespeare plays, or Shakespeare in general, appears in the Game of Thrones in A Song of Ice and Fire is essentially in the methodology of how the scenes are presented, as well as the character arcs or character development. So for instance, in the Shakespeare plays, you don't get all the details of what happened in history. You don't see every event. He takes a little bit of artistic license, and surely he's writing 100 years afterwards, so he doesn't really know what people said. He kind of makes it up as he goes along, but then he presents it in certain scenes, so you get this monologue or these dialogues and a little bit of action, and it represents what actually happened in total. And that's very much how the Game of Thrones is acting against the books of A Song of Ice and Fire. If you actually read the books of A Song of Ice and Fire, you'd know a lot more about what was going on. But so Game of Thrones doesn't have that luxury. They only have so long during an episode, and so many episodes in a season, and so many seasons that they're going to present. So they have to present to you these little snippets of scenes. And for some people, it's unsatisfying because maybe they have read the books and they have a clue. And they're like, why did he present it that way? Why are D&D presenting it like that? Or what is this writing that that isn't what happened? Well, that's pretty much Shakespeare in a nutshell, because there are so many things that he presents in a scene that isn't 100% exactly how things happen, particularly 1 or 2 battles. The death of Richard, Duke of York, which is Edward IV and Richard III's father. That's not exactly how it happened in history, but it's good enough that the audience gets the idea of what happened and how traumatic and dramatic it was. And of course, if you're a person back in the day, or even now, and you're going to go watch Henry VI, Part 1, Part 2, and Richard III, if you were somebody who only saw Richard III, Maybe you never saw the other two plays before. Shakespeare actually writes things into the Richard III play that refers back to these other plays. So if you hadn't seen the other ones, you would totally miss them. And it's almost like a gift to his regular patrons, right? So if you saw his other plays, you would get stuff that he was referencing and be like, ah, right? And if you hadn't, maybe somebody says, well, this happened, blah, 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 this happened in this other play, and it might prompt you to go and see his other plays. So this is a way to keep the interest going. And it's very much like, popping into the Game of Thrones and just catching season 6. You'd be completely confused. What the hell? Arya cooked these dudes into a frayed pie? That's disgusting. What kind of evil? That's just terrible. She just must be some evil person. But if you'd actually watched the Game of Thrones from season 1 forward, you would get it, and you wouldn't be so completely disgusted. Even though it's still a disgusting act, you would get why things are happening. Or maybe, one of the other ones would be like the Lyanna Stark thing in the tower. So if you were a book reader, you were way ahead of the people who were just watching the Game of Thrones. They didn't have as much clue. So if you're a book reader or you've been watching other videos on YouTube to fill in the gaps, you had a clue long before everybody else. And so it's very much like Game of Thrones is very much like the Shakespeare thing. If you'd seen the other plays, you'd be ahead of the game. You'd be ahead of the other people in the audience. Then there's that idea about the character development or the character arc. So, interestingly, if you just watched the Richard III play, you would have just got this idea he was a villain because he was a villain. And he even says it during the play that he's like not sure why he's a villain. He just must be, right? And he even he even talks about some of the rationales. He's trying to rationalize to himself why he's the villain. Well, because I'm misshapen and nobody loves me, or I've never really been loved that much, and I'm not. I can't have any relationships with people or women in particular. And so, yeah, this has made me a villain. But you get the idea that he doesn't actually believe that either, and he's not 100% sure. And it's a really shallow reason to be such a freaking villain. And it is. You would actually know why Richard III was a villain if you had gone back and watched, Henry VI, Part 1 and Part 2, and you would see what actually had been happening all along in this War of the Roses, how it was like a blood feud, and every act, of either battle, death, or even outright murder just perpetuates the cycle of continuing battle and even murders. And this is what happens to Richard III. Like his father, the Duke of York, is killed in the battle. They just hack him to pieces, which is essentially what happens to Richard III later. And then his brother Edmund is captured, and they strip him of his armor, and then they murder him. So Richard III wasn't actually there to see it, though Shakespeare represents it that way, but he probably certainly heard about it. And just like a bunch of other people in the play who are talking about how they're getting their revenge, that's really, you get the idea that Richard III isn't really acting out of character for people in that period. It would be like popping into season 6 and seeing Cersei the way she is, and she just seems so cold, and she does these evil deeds, and then her son dies, and she's like, burn his body and toss him in with the other ones. And you'd be thinking, wow, what a cold wench. But if you had seen the entire Game of Thrones series, you would understand why Cersei was the way she was. Then there's the end of Richard III. And at the end, there's the Battle of Bosworth. Richmond, that's who they call him in the play, by the way, that's Henry Tudor or Henry VII, kills Richard III. And maybe he doesn't even totally recognize him, but he just, finally smashes him. And then he takes the crown on the battlefield. And then the next scene that you see is that he's marrying Elizabeth of York, and he makes this little speech. But they've ended this terrible War of the Roses, and they've unified England. And then the lights go down on the stage, and they fade into history, which is exactly what happens to Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. And that's how our story of A Game of Thrones is going to end. So, go catch this series. I guarantee you'll love it. Thank you very much. hit the like button, leave a comment. I'll talk to you later.